Good evening, friend. My name doesn't matter much anymore, but what I did with my life, that's a story worth telling. I'm 70 years old now, and today I was walking through a little bookstore downtown with my grandson. He was darting between the shelves like a sparrow, his hands brushing the spines of books he didn't yet understand but wanted so much to touch. I paused at one shelf and noticed a book, its cover frayed, its binding worn thin, a small tear running along the edge of its spine. My fingers went instinctively to it, the way an old carpenter might reach for a hammer, or a farmer might brush the soil from his palms. That single torn book, it brought me back to the smell of paper and dust, of ink and polished wood, of the quiet rustle of pages in a library that had been my world for so many decades. You see, before the gray in my beard and the ache in my knees, I was a librarian. That was my life's calling. Not just a man who shelved books, no, I was a keeper of stories, a guide for lost souls searching for answers, a guardian of silence in a world that often shouted too loudly. And standing there in that bookstore, with my grandson tugging at my sleeve, I felt the years peel away. The present dissolved, and I was no longer a tired old man. I was a boy, wide-eyed and hungry for knowledge, discovering the first whispers of who I would become. It all started long ago in a small Midwestern town where books were both scarce and sacred. My father was a factory worker. My mother kept the home, and money was tight. But there was a little library, a red brick building with tall windows and creaky wooden floors. The first time I walked through those doors, I smelled the paper and glue, and I swear it was like stepping into another universe. The librarian then, Miss Carter, smiled at me, handed me a card and said, "Every answer you'll ever need is somewhere in here, son. You just have to be patient enough to find it." From that moment on, I knew this was where I belonged. And so, as I stand in this bookstore now, the torn book in my hands, I realize I've come full circle. My life has been bound together page by page, chapter by chapter, in the same way those books filled the shelves of my youth. But let me take you back. Let me tell you how it all unfolded, how a poor boy found his way among the stacks, grew into a man, and lived a life among books, stories, and people who came seeking something they couldn't always name. Because that was my life. The life of an American librarian. I must have been 8, maybe 9, the first time I realized the library was more than a building. It was a refuge. The world outside could be loud, machines from the factory clanging, men arguing over pay, my father coming home with grease on his hands and tiredness carved into his face. But inside the library, there was only the soft turning of pages, the smell of old paper mingled with floor polish, and the muffled coughs of people too polite to make noise. I'd slip into a wooden chair, my legs dangling too short to touch the floor, and lose myself in books far too big for me. History, geography, stories of faraway lands, those were my escapes. I remember holding an atlas once, tracing my finger along the curves of rivers and mountains I'd never see, dreaming of places I'd never visit. Miss Carter, the librarian, always noticed. She had this way of seeing right through you, as though she knew exactly what your young heart was hungry for. One afternoon, she placed a book in front of me, The Secret Garden. I remember frowning at it, thinking it looked too much like a girl's book. She just smiled and said, "Every man needs a garden, son, even if it's only in his imagination." I devoured it, and for the first time, I understood that books didn't just tell you things, they healed you. They gave you worlds you could carry around when your own felt too small. The library became my second home. I knew every corner, every crack in the wooden floorboards, every sunbeam that fell across the tables in the afternoon. Some days I'd help Miss Carter reshelve books, pretending I was her assistant, proud of every volume I slid back into place. I didn't know it then, but those little acts were seeds being planted deep inside me, seeds that would one day grow into a calling. But being a boy in America back then wasn't just about quiet afternoons and libraries. It was baseball in the sandlot, running barefoot down dusty roads, the smell of hamburgers frying at the diner on Main Street. Still, even as the other boys laughed and played, part of me longed for the hushed, sacred air of the stacks. It was where I felt whole. And when my parents argued about bills late at night, when my father's frustration boiled over in ways I didn't understand, I'd close my eyes and imagine myself back among the books, safe, still. Funny thing is, I didn't just fall in love with reading. I fell in love with the idea of keeping order in the chaos. Books needed to be cared for, protected, just like people. And I suppose, in some way, that's what set me on the path to becoming a librarian. The belief that stories deserved guardians. Looking back, I can see it so clearly now. The boy who sat in that chair, his shoes too big, his eyes too wide, already knew. He just didn't have the words for it yet. By the time I was a teenager, the library wasn't just a place I visited, it was a place I belonged to. I was maybe 14 when Miss Carter offered me my first small job, sweeping the floors at closing time and helping with the returns cart. It wasn't much, but to me, it felt like being given the keys to a kingdom. I'll never forget the first evening she handed me the brass key to the back door. It was heavier than I expected, cool in my palm, and I swear my heart swelled 2 sizes just holding it. That key meant trust. It meant responsibility. And in those years, that meant the world to me. After school, while other boys were pumping gas at the station or stocking shelves at the grocery store, I'd head straight for the library. The place had its own rhythm. The smell of polished oak desks, the faint tick of the clock above the front desk, and the hush that settled as people leaned over their books like they were protecting secrets. I learned how to mend torn pages with a steady hand, how to stamp the cards just right so the date lined up neat and even. It wasn't glamorous work, but I felt pride in every little task. And the library taught me discipline, patience, and maybe even kindness. I saw men coming in after long shifts at the factory, their hands cracked and blackened with grease, looking for war histories or manuals on mechanics. I saw mothers guiding their children to the picture book section, their faces weary but lit with quiet joy as their kids discovered colors and stories. And I noticed something about myself. I liked helping. I liked seeing that spark in someone's eyes when I pointed them toward the book they didn't even know they were looking for. That felt more rewarding than any paycheck. Of course, being a teenager, I still had my share of restlessness. There were nights spent at the drive-in, the taste of root beer on my tongue, the sound of rock and roll pouring from car radios. There were ball games, Friday dances, and the clumsy, thrilling awkwardness of first dates. But no matter what, I always found myself drawn back to those shelves. And I'll admit, part of it was also the peace. My home life wasn't always easy. Money was tight, arguments were frequent, and there were days when my father's temper got the better of him. At the library, though, the world seemed to soften. I could breathe. By the time I was 16, I wasn't just sweeping floors. I was cataloging books, shelving in the Dewey Decimal System like it was second nature, even helping to order new volumes. Ms. Carter said I had a librarian's mind, organized, curious, and protective of details. I didn't tell her, but hearing that made me feel taller than I was. Funny thing is, at that age, I didn't yet see it as a career. I thought maybe I'd end up teaching or working at the post office or following my father into the factory. But deep down, every time I closed the library at night, locking the doors behind me and smelling the faint perfume of ink and dust in the air, I felt something stir, like the books were whispering to me, "Stay." By the time I graduated high school in the late 50s, the world felt wide open but uncertain. Most of the boys I knew had plans laid out for them, factory jobs like their fathers, the military for some, college for the lucky few. I stood somewhere in between. I wasn't the strongest with a wrench or the fastest on the football field, but I knew how to listen, how to observe, how to find answers tucked between pages. It was Ms. Carter, the librarian, who'd first taken me under her wing, who pushed me to think bigger. One evening, as I helped her reshelve the biographies, she stopped and looked me square in the eye. "You don't just like books, John," she said. "You understand people through them. You should think about library science." At first, I laughed. It sounded lofty, but she was serious. She handed me a brochure from the state college. The cover showed young men and women, neat in their suits and skirts, studying card catalogs and preservation techniques. Libraries will always need caretakers, not just of paper and ink, but of stories, of history, of truth. Something about that struck me deep. So while some of my buddies headed off to boot camp and others settled into shifts at the steel plant, I packed a small suitcase, kissed my mother goodbye, and rode the Greyhound to the State University. It was the first time I'd ever really left home. I still remember the bus window rattling, the blur of cornfields and small towns rushing past, and that nervous mix of fear and excitement in my stomach. College was a world of its own. I shared a dorm room with a farm boy from Iowa and a lanky kid from Chicago who smoked too much and talked about jazz like it was religion. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who cared about ideas as much as hard work. I soaked it all in. Literature classes, philosophy lectures, and of course, the courses in library science. Those classes taught me more than just how to alphabetize titles or file catalog cards. They taught me about order and access, about the responsibility of making knowledge available to everyone, not just the privileged. I learned about preservation, how a book printed in the 1800s needed careful handling, how humidity could ruin leather bindings, and how the right kind of paper could outlast centuries. And I'll admit, there was another education happening too. I discovered what it meant to fall in love. There was a girl named Margaret, bright-eyed, with freckles across her nose and a laugh that carried across the campus quad. She studied English literature, and we'd spend hours together in the library stacks, her reading poetry aloud while I pretended to study Dewey Decimal. I was clumsy, awkward, and head over heels. Of course, not everything was idyllic. The late 50s bled into the early 60s, and the country was shifting. Protests, civil rights marches, the looming shadow of Vietnam, those things crept even into the quiet halls of the library. I saw students arrested, professors dismissed,
and debates that turned into shouting matches in the student union.
It was the first time I realized that libraries weren't just places of silence. They were battlegrounds, too, where knowledge, ideas, and truth were defended. I began to feel a sense of calling. This wasn't just a job. This was something worth dedicating a life to. By the time I walked across that stage and accepted my degree, I knew I wasn't going back to the factory or the post office. I was going to spend my life among the stacks, among the whispers of ink and paper. And I felt proud. Nervous, yes, but proud. Fresh out of college, diploma in hand, I felt taller than I'd ever been. But pride alone doesn't pay bills. I applied to library jobs all over the state, sometimes writing applications by hand late at night under a bare bulb, licking envelopes with more hope than certainty. Finally, one autumn morning in 1966, a letter arrived from a small-town library in Ohio. They needed an assistant librarian. Modest pay, long hours, but to me, it was gold. I'll never forget walking through those doors on my first day. The library wasn't grand, no marble columns or vaulted ceilings, but it had character. Sturdy oak shelves lined the walls, polished smooth by decades of fingers pulling books free. The air was a mixture of ink, dust, and the faintest trace of lemon oil the janitor used on the floors. The light filtered in through tall, narrow windows, catching dust motes that hung in the air like little stars. I was nervous, of course. My boss, Mr. Whitaker, was a man of few words, gray-haired and perpetually frowning. He handed me a stack of catalog cards and muttered, "File these and don't mess up." That was my training. But once I slipped into the rhythm of it all, I found peace in the order of it all. There was something almost meditative about sliding cards into their rightful place, about walking the aisles and returning each book home. I started recognizing regular visitors. The elderly widow who came every Thursday for romance novels, the young boy with freckles who devoured every science book we had, the middle-aged man who pretended to browse but always lingered by the war history section. And then there were the kids. Every Saturday, the library filled with the sound of their laughter and chaos. I was assigned to story hour, something I'd never imagined myself doing. At first, I stumbled through the children's books, my voice stiff, my hands clumsy with the oversized pages. But the more I read, the more I loosened up. I started adding silly voices, pausing for dramatic effect. Before long, I had a little crowd of wide-eyed faces hanging on every word. It was in those moments I realized libraries weren't just about books. They were about people. Lonely souls finding company in a story. Curious minds discovering new worlds. Children building dreams out of fairy tales and science fiction. I wasn't just filing cards or checking out titles. I was helping people connect to something bigger than themselves. Still, it wasn't always easy. The budget was thin. Some days we couldn't afford new books, and I had to patch together old copies with tape, careful not to lose any pages. Teenagers sometimes carved their initials into the wooden tables, and I'd sand the grooves down at night. There were days I went home with an aching back, ink-stained fingers, and doubts gnawing at me. Was this really the life I wanted? But then, one evening, as I was closing up, a little girl tugged on my sleeve. She handed me a crumpled piece of paper with a drawing on it, a stick figure me surrounded by books with the words, "Thank you for reading to us." I still have that drawing, tucked away in a box. That was the moment I knew. Yes, this was the life I was meant for.
It was in that same small-town library where my life truly changed, not because of the books, but because of her. Her name was Margaret. She was a school teacher, about my age, with chestnut hair that seemed to glow golden in the afternoon sun streaming through the library's tall windows. She first came in looking for a copy of Pride and Prejudice for her students. I can still see her standing by the circulation desk, smiling politely, her voice soft but steady as she asked, "Do you have any Austen?" I nearly tripped over my words, fumbling with the catalog cards, my hands sweating like a boy on his first date. When I finally found the book, I handed it to her like it was some priceless treasure. And in a way, it was the beginning of something. She started coming back regularly, always with a new excuse. Books for her class, poetry for herself, gardening manuals she probably didn't need. Sometimes we'd find ourselves in the reading room, talking long after her official visit was over. At first, it was about books, of course, but soon about life. She told me of her students, her dreams of having a family, her worries about the world. I'd told her about my childhood, about wanting to do something meaningful, even if it wasn't glamorous. I remember one winter evening, thunder rolling in the distance, the library nearly empty. She sat across from me, a book untouched in her lap. The rain tapped on the windows like an old rhythm, steady and soothing. I don't know what came over me, but I leaned forward and said, "Margaret, would you let me take you out for coffee sometime?" She laughed, not a mocking laugh, but one that warmed me straight through. I was wondering when you'd ask. Our courtship wasn't flashy. We didn't have much money, just walks through town, cheap cups of coffee, Sunday picnics in the park. But we had something steady, something real. When I finally asked her to marry me, it wasn't in a grand gesture. It was in the quiet of the library itself. I hid a little note in the book she had borrowed, collected poems of Robert Frost. Inside, on the margin of The Road Not Taken, I'd written, "Margaret, will you walk this road with me?" She said yes, with tears in her eyes. And from that moment forward, my life gained a rhythm I hadn't known before. We married in a modest church, nothing extravagant, just friends, family, and the smell of fresh lilies in the air. I wore my best, and only, suit, and she wore a simple white dress that made her look more radiant than any bride I had ever seen. Afterward, we danced in the town hall to scratchy music from a rented record player. Life wasn't perfect. We didn't have much money starting out, and the library job didn't pay a fortune, but Margaret never once complained. We made our little house a home. She filled the windowsills with plants, and I stacked books wherever there was space. Our first child, a daughter, came a year later, followed by a son 3 years after that. The sound of children's laughter in our home was like a new chapter being written. Sometimes chaotic, sometimes exhausting, but always full of life. And all the while, I kept working in that library, each day blending into the next, cataloging books, guiding students through research, reading stories to children, watching generations pass through the heavy oak doors. Some faces disappeared. Some kept returning. And Margaret, she was always by my side, steady and strong, reminding me why the work mattered. Looking back now, I realize those years were the foundation of everything. The marriage, the children, the steady work. It was quiet, yes, but it was rich. And though I didn't know it then, the challenges were only beginning. The years rolled on, and with them, the world outside our small town began to shift in ways I could hardly ignore. I sometimes joke that I measured time not by calendars, but by the books that passed through my hands. Every generation left a trail of titles behind like footprints in the sand. In the 60s, it was Steinbeck, Kerouac, Baldwin. Young men with long hair came in asking for On the Road, their eyes restless, searching. A few came back weeks later, confessing they had hitchhiked halfway across the country after reading it.
Emily, on the other hand, adored poetry. I'd often find her humming little rhymes she made up herself, as if the rhythm of the written word had already taken root in her. But being a father wasn't without its storms. I worried constantly about money, about the world outside. The 70s were turbulent, with protests, wars, and changes I couldn't always explain to my children. Sometimes, after tucking them in, I'd stand by the window, staring out at the quiet street, and wonder if I was preparing them enough for the world that awaited. There were sacrifices, too. I turned down promotions that would have taken me to bigger libraries in bigger cities because I didn't want to uproot the kids. Margaret supported me, though I knew she sometimes wondered what life might have been like had we taken those chances. Still, we chose stability, the kind of rooted life where the kids could grow steady, like trees with deep roots. Some of my proudest memories aren't of awards or library milestones, they're of the nights we spent together as a family. Summer evenings on the porch, fireflies glowing in the yard, Margaret reading aloud while the kids leaned against us, half asleep. Winter nights, all of us bundled under blankets by the fireplace, Daniel asking 100 questions about knights and explorers, while Emily recited verses from memory. Life had its share of disappointments, too. There was the day Daniel came home from high school, angry and bitter, slamming his door because he thought we didn't understand him. And Emily, in college, calling home in tears after her first heartbreak. Those moments hurt in a way nothing else could. You can mend a torn book with tape and glue, but you can't so easily fix a broken heart. And yet, through it all, I realized that the same patience I had learned in the library, the slow work of care, of attention, was the very thing I needed most as a father. Books taught me that stories take time to unfold, and so do children. You don't always see the ending from the first chapter, but you trust the journey. Now, all these years later, watching my grown children with families of their own, I know I didn't get everything right. But I gave them roots, I gave them stories, and I gave them love. And in the end, maybe that's enough. As the years pressed on, the library itself began to change, and so did I. When I first started, everything was paper and ink, catalog cards and neat little drawers, the scent of glue and worn bindings, the rustle of pages echoing softly through the aisles. But by the 80s and 90s, machines started creeping in. Computers, scanners, new systems that promised efficiency, but felt, to me, a little colder than the old ways. I remember the first time I had to explain the computer catalog to a patron. She was an older woman, like me now, and her hands trembled as she tapped the keys. I guided her gently, like showing someone how to handle a delicate book. Her relief when the screen lit up with the titles she'd been searching for reminded me that though the tools had changed, the heart of the work hadn't. People still came for knowledge, for stories, for connection. And yet, I confess, those years weren't easy. The world was moving faster than I liked. I saw kids spending more time on video games than in the reading room. I watched the newspapers shrink, their smell of fresh ink disappearing as the internet grew. There were nights I'd sit at my desk,
long after closing, staring at the glowing screen and wondering if the place I had devoted my life to would even survive another generation. Still, I kept on. Part of being a librarian was being a bridge between what was and what was coming. I trained younger staff, many of them just out of college, who seemed to type faster than they breathed. Some of them respected the old ways. Others rolled their eyes when I showed them how to repair a torn page or paste a new pocket inside the back cover. But I never stopped teaching, because preserving the spirit of the library mattered more than keeping up with trends. Community recognition came slowly. I wasn't the type of man to chase attention, but over time the faces around me let me know I had made a difference. Parents thanked me for keeping Story Hour alive. Teachers brought in classes year after year and told me their students looked forward to my lessons more than the ones in their own classrooms. And sometimes, grown men and women, former children I had helped decades before, would walk in, shake my hand, and tell me that the love of books they carried started in that little library with me. Those moments, well, they were worth every late night and every small frustration. But life outside the library carried shadows. My children had grown and gone, leaving the house quieter than it had ever been. Margaret and I filled the silence with walks, with quiet dinners, with evenings side by side, each reading our own book. Yet there were fears that clung to me, fears of the future, of being left behind, of one day walking into the library and realizing I was a stranger in the very place I had built my life around. I suppose that's the hardest part of growing older. The world doesn't ask your permission before it changes. All you can do is hold on to what you've built and hope it matters enough to last. And somehow, in that old library, among shelves that had held me steady through decades of change, I began to realize that maybe it wasn't the building or the tools that mattered most. It was the people, always the people, the children who grew, the neighbors who found solace, the lost souls who discovered themselves between the covers of a book. That thought carried me forward, even as the years pulled me toward retirement. By the time my hair had gone fully gray and my hands bore the veins and spots of age, I knew the end of my career was close. I'd walk into the library each morning with the same keys jangling in my pocket, the same leather satchel tucked under my arm, but my pace had slowed. The building seemed quieter than it once had, not because it truly was, but because I felt time passing differently. The younger librarians often teased me, kindly, about my rituals. I still polished the wood of the circulation desk myself every Friday evening. I still straightened the chairs, though others told me it wasn't necessary. I still carried the little bell that had once sat on the counter, though we hadn't used it in decades. To them, it was quaint. To me, it was continuity. It was respect for a space that had been more than just a workplace. And yet, the weight of years brought its doubts. Some nights I'd lie awake beside Margaret, wondering if I had done enough. Had I truly made an impact? Would the library remember me once I was gone? Or would my years of service be buried under new technology and new faces? These thoughts haunted me more than I like to admit. I never spoke of them to my children, though. A father's job is to give his kids confidence, not burden them with his own insecurities. But then, there were the moments that quieted the fear. A boy, 12, maybe 13, once rushed up to me with a book clutched to his chest, eyes shining. He said, "Mr. Thompson, I didn't even like reading before you showed me this series. Now I want to read all of them." His voice cracked a little, that awkward stage between boyhood and adolescence, but it struck me deep. because I remembered the first time someone put a book in my own young hands and said, "This could be yours too." Toward the end, the community began to whisper about my retirement. I hadn't spoken of it openly, but word travels fast in a small town. People asked, "When will you go? Who will take your place?" I didn't have all the answers, but I knew the day was coming. The library board arranged a small gathering. They called it a celebration of service, though the words embarrassed me. I never liked being the center of attention. But when the day came, and I walked into that meeting room, the same one I had used for decades of book clubs, story hours, and late-night town discussions, I froze. The place was filled. Old patrons, young parents with children in tow, former staff members, even a few of my former teachers who were still alive. They had come not for the library, but for me. One by one, they stood up to speak. Some told stories of books I had found for them, others of quiet encouragement I had offered during harder times. I heard tales I barely remembered, helping a man study for his GED, comforting a widow who came to read poetry aloud to herself after her husband passed, guiding a child through his first research paper. It was as though my life's work had been reflected back at me, piece by piece, until I could see the whole mosaic clearly for the first time. And when they presented me with a plaque carved from oak with my name etched beneath the words, "For a lifetime of service to knowledge and community," I felt something I had not let myself feel in years: peace. Margaret squeezed my hand that night as we walked home under the street lamps. She said softly, "You gave them more than books. You gave them yourself." And for the first time, I believed her. The first weeks after retirement were strange. The mornings no longer held the ritual of unlocking the library doors, of greeting familiar faces, of the comforting smell of paper and polished wood. Instead, I found myself wandering through quiet rooms at home, Margaret reading beside me, the house filled with soft sunlight and an unfamiliar silence. At first, I tried to fill the emptiness. I visited friends, ran errands I had once postponed, tinkered with old hobbies like sketching and minor woodworking. Yet every afternoon, my thoughts drifted back to the library, the hushed corridors, the distant laughter of children during story hour, the satisfaction of sliding a requested book across the counter with a smile. That rhythm, once so ordinary, had become a heartbeat I could no longer hear. But as the days stretched on, I began noticing things I hadn't paid attention to in years. The way Margaret's hands moved over the garden soil, planting tulips for spring. The sound of birdsong drifting in through open windows. The small, quiet gratitude of neighbors stopping by to chat. Life outside the library, I realized, had its own lessons, its own poetry. I began writing letters to former students, sharing memories, recommending books, and hearing back from them in return. Each letter reminded me that influence doesn't end when the job does. It continues, quietly, unseen, in hearts and minds shaped by years of guidance. I also found joy in new routines. Morning walks with Margaret, afternoons reading newspapers from cover to cover, evenings spent watching classic films and discussing them, reminiscing about the past with a warmth that sometimes brought tears to my eyes. The quiet allowed me to reflect, to see my life in full, to appreciate the decades of small, steady actions that had built not just the library, but a community, and through it, my own identity. Friends and former colleagues still visited occasionally. They brought news, stories, laughter, and sometimes concerns. And each time I realized how much I had given and how much had been returned, not in accolades or money, but in the simple trust and love of a community that had grown around the library and me. One day, while sitting on the porch, sipping tea, I looked at the garden. the neighborhood, and thought, life is full of seasons. Some are loud, some are quiet, some demanding, some gentle. And just as a library preserves the stories of decades, I had preserved memories in people, in hearts, in lessons passed on. That, I knew, would last longer than any plaque or award. I was still a librarian, in a sense, not behind the desk, but in spirit, in memory, in influence. Retirement hadn't taken that from me. As the years of retirement unfolded, I found myself revisiting memories I had tucked away for decades. The friends who had walked beside me through the long hallways of the library, the colleagues who had shared late nights shelving books, and the students whose lives I had glimpsed so briefly yet profoundly. Some of them were gone now, taken by illness or the slow march of time, and the weight of their absence pressed heavily on my chest. I remembered Mr. Whitaker, a fellow librarian who had joined the library the same year I had. We had shared endless cups of coffee, debated which novels belonged on the recommended shelf, and joked about the eccentricities of our patrons. His passing had left a quiet void, one that no ceremony or memorial could fill. Yet each time I walked past the library in my mind, I felt his presence in the corners, in the soft echo of laughter and the pages of books we had loved together. Loss wasn't the only lesson. Friendship, I realized, was often quiet, sometimes unnoticed until years later. I thought of Margaret's unwavering support during the busiest seasons, when I had returned home exhausted but fulfilled. I remembered my students. Some had become close friends in adulthood, writing letters or calling to discuss books or life. Each connection was a thread, weaving a tapestry of shared experience that stretched across decades. And then there were the moments of regret, small and fleeting, when I wished I had said more, encouraged more, or simply listened better. Yet with reflection, I understood that life is not measured solely by perfection, but by effort, presence, and the willingness to give oneself to others. The library had taught me that. My friendships had reinforced it. Even the losses, painful as they were, reminded me of the depth of love, the intensity of connection, and the fragility of time. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the garden outside my window was bathed in golden light, I realized that my life, with all its triumphs and losses, was rich and full. I had loved deeply, guided others, been guided myself, and experienced the fullness of human connection. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I felt a profound gratitude for the people, the books, the lessons, and the enduring warmth of shared stories. I knew then that though I would never again walk the aisles of the library as a librarian, I would always carry it, and those who had shared it with me, in my heart. Even in the quiet rhythm of teaching, life had a way of surprising me. I remember one spring afternoon when a group of students begged me to take them on an impromptu library scavenger hunt. We spent hours navigating the stacks, solving riddles I had hidden between shelves, and laughing until our sides ached. The thrill wasn't just theirs, it coursed through me, reminding me that learning could be an adventure even in the most familiar of places. There were also the moments outside the classroom that left a mark on my heart. Once, Margaret and I organized a small book fair at the local park. Children ran between tents filled with stories of distant lands, while parents sipped coffee and exchanged smiles. I remember crouching down to help a shy girl choose her first novel. Her eyes lit up, her fingers trembling as she held the book close. "I've never read a book like this," she whispered. And in that whisper, I felt the power of my work. Not just the facts I taught, but the spark of imagination I had helped ignite. Travel, too, brought unexpected joys. Summer trips to historical libraries, museums, and botanical gardens allowed me to share with students the broader world beyond our town. I recall the smell of old wood and parchment in centuries-old libraries, the crisp air on mountaintop paths, the scent of flowers in faraway gardens. Those excursions taught me that education wasn't just in textbooks. It was in experience, in observation, in connection with the living world. And then there were the little surprises of life. Former students returning years later, now adults with children of their own, introducing them to books that had once inspired them. Hearing stories of how they applied lessons from our classroom to their lives, how they became doctors, artists, or even librarians themselves, filled me with a quiet, enduring pride. In those moments, I understood that life's true adventures weren't always grand or dramatic. They were found in shared laughter, in curiosity awakened, in hands held across generations, and in the quiet knowledge that even small gestures could leave a lasting imprint. I had lived more richly than I had ever imagined, and these adventures, small though they seemed, became treasures I carried into retirement. As the years unfolded and the library doors closed behind me for the final time, I began to understand the true weight of legacy. It wasn't in plaques, certificates, or awards. It was in the lives I had touched, the curiosity I had nurtured, and the lessons that had quietly traveled with my students into adulthood. Every thank you note, every letter from a former pupil, every unexpected visit from someone I had taught decades earlier reminded me that my work had mattered in ways I could never fully measure. I remember Mr. Thompson, who had struggled with reading in the 2nd grade. He returned years later, a successful teacher himself, bringing his own children to the library. "You believed in me when no one else did," he said, his eyes moist. In that moment, I understood the true meaning of my profession, the ripples of encouragement, patience, and belief that extend far beyond the walls of a classroom. Margaret often sat with me in the evenings, listening as I recounted old stories, the pranks of mischievous students, the quiet victories of shy learners discovering their voices, the small arguments with colleagues that always ended in laughter. She would smile knowingly, reminding me that every story, every memory was a thread in the tapestry of a life lived fully. Even in my neighborhood, former students and families would stop to say hello, to share how a particular book or lesson had shaped their lives. I felt an overwhelming gratitude for the community I had been part of, for the shared experiences that had woven us together across decades. And with each interaction, I realized that my legacy was not just mine. It belonged to all of us, to the countless people whose lives had intersected with mine in fleeting but meaningful ways. By the time my retirement years settled into a gentle rhythm, I felt a profound peace. I had taught, guided, laughed, and occasionally scolded. But above all, I had connected. I had left behind more than knowledge. I had left respect, care, and inspiration. That was the inheritance I cherished most, and one that I knew would endure long after I was gone. Now, as I sit on my porch with the evening sun painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, I often let my mind drift through the decades behind me. I see a younger version of myself walking into the library for the first time, full of hope and nervous excitement. I see a younger version of myself walking into the library for the first time, full of hope and nervous excitement. I see the classrooms, the stacks of books, the bustling halls, and the quiet corners where ideas blossomed. I remember the laughter of children, the whispered questions, the moments of doubt, and the quiet victories that marked each day. I think of Margaret, always by my side, sharing both the burdens and joys of my work. I think of my students, some now grown with families of their own, and the knowledge that, in small but meaningful ways, I shaped a part of their journeys. I recall friendships forged in the margins of bookshelves, the camaraderie of colleagues, the bittersweet losses of those who left too soon. And I feel it all, the love, the joy, the challenges, the regrets, and I carry them with me as a testament to a life fully lived. I know life is fleeting, fragile, and unpredictable, yet in every chapter I found purpose. In every book taught, every question answered, every hand held, I discovered meaning. Even in retirement, even in the quiet moments, I feel the pulse of those memories, a comforting rhythm that reminds me I lived, I loved, I guided, and I learned. And now, as I watch my grandson run through the garden, his laughter echoing across the yard, I feel a profound peace. I am proud, content, and grateful. I have no regrets that weigh heavily on me. Instead, I carry the joy of a life spent giving, connecting, and shaping a world beyond myself. In the end, this is the story I leave behind. Not just in books or records, but in hearts, minds, and memories. Yes, my story is mine, but it belongs to everyone who touched it. And for that, I am eternally grateful. Life in all its messy, beautiful, unpredictable ways has been a gift, and I have cherished every moment.